So before listening to this sermon, if you could please read Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, all the way up to chapter 2, verse 11. The title of this sermon is The God Who Keeps His Promises. I'd like you to first put up your hand if you've seen at least one film based on the Exodus story. My guess is that you've probably seen at least one film based on the Exodus story. Perhaps you've seen the epic film, The Ten Commandments, or the DreamWorks cartoon, The Prince of Egypt, or you might have seen the more recent film, Exodus: Gods and Kings, starring Christian Bale. You've probably also read at least one of its stories. The story of Moses and the burning bush, and the story of the 10 plagues, are stories that have been told many times. But though you might be familiar with many of the stories and the characters of Exodus, the main purpose of Exodus is to help us to get to know God better. Exodus is all about God revealing who He is. For example, when God tells Moses to tell the Israelites that God is going to rescue them, Moses asks God, "What is your name? Who are you? Are you someone we can trust?" When Moses tells Pharaoh to let God's people go, Pharaoh asks, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? Who are you? Are you someone I should obey?" And then, when Moses gives Israel God's 10 commandments, God introduces himself first. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." Who are you? God? Should I love you? God's answer, yes, because I have first loved you. The main purpose of Exodus is to help us to get to know better who God is. And this is a very countercultural idea. For chances are, if you scan the non-fiction shelf of your local library, chances are you'll find many books about better knowing yourself. There'll be books about understanding ourselves, books about believing in ourselves, books about loving ourselves, and books about self-help or self-fulfillment. The modern idea is that by better knowing ourselves and loving ourselves, our problems will be less and our lives will be more fulfilling. And yet we all face problems that are bigger than us. And often those with the most money and most opportunity to love themselves and fulfill all of their dreams, often some of these people commit suicide or report feeling very unfulfilled. And so though you could spend the rest of your life reading every self-orientated book in the library, a better place to start would be Exodus, page 1. So, what do we discover on page 1, chapter 1 of Exodus? And what is the relevance to our daily lives? Well, first of all, we discover the God. Firstly, we discover the God. Now, the other day, I watched my first Donald Trump rally on the internet, and though he didn't declare himself to be God, he certainly made out that he was someone important. He made the wisest decisions regarding coronavirus. He was the one that Americans could trust with their vote. He was the greatest president in American history, and everyone in the crowd agreed. Why? Why did everyone agree? Well, because it's very easy to declare yourself to be the greatest on your home turf, which in Donald Trump's case was the Republican Party rally. It's very easy to declare yourself to be the greatest on your home turf, but it's a lot more difficult to prove that you are the greatest in the face of opposition. If Donald Trump walked down your street this afternoon, declaring himself to be the greatest, what would happen? Would people cheer? Would people agree? Would Donald Trump survive to tell the story? You know, it's very easy to declare yourself to be the greatest on your home turf, but it's a lot more difficult to do this in the face of opposition. In Exodus chapter 1, page 1, we find God's people, Israel, in the middle of Egypt. They are not on home turf. In fact, they are in the middle of great opposition. The king worshipped many Egyptian gods, gods of the water, the land, and the sky, and it was supposedly thanks to these gods that Egypt was so powerful and influential. This was the perfect time for Egypt's gods and Egypt's king to declare themselves to be the greatest. This was the perfect time for Israel to forget about God, give up on God, and worship the gods of Egypt instead. And yet it's at this time, in the face of this much opposition, that God declares himself to be the God, the one and only God. We see several examples of this from verse 8 onwards. Chapter 1, verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. In Genesis, the first book of the Bible, God makes a promise to a man named Abraham, a promise that his family would become a great nation, that God would greatly bless. In the second book of the Bible, Exodus, the king of Egypt plans to stop these promises coming to fruition. The king plans to curse God's people by making them slaves. The king plans to stop them multiplying by telling the midwives to kill the Israelite baby boys, and by telling the Egyptians to kill any that they see alive. But in the battle between God's promises and the king's plans, God wins. Despite the king's best efforts, the Israelites keep on multiplying. Despite Egypt being the most powerful nation at that time, God sets his enslaved people go. Who is God? Not the king of Egypt, nor the gods of Egypt. The Lord is God, and no one else. The Lord who reveals himself to us in the book of Exodus, is the one and the only God. So information, God is the God. Application, God is the only one that we should fear. Now, to talk about the fear of God sounds pretty archaic and old-fashioned. Even now you might be picturing some native people sacrificing cows whilst looking to the sky, fearing that if they don't make these sacrifices, some ancient god will send lightning bolts in their direction. Or you might be picturing a 19th century church full of people who only go because they fear the God who can send them to hell. The subject of hell being the subject of the sermon nearly every week. You know, to talk about the fear of God sounds pretty archaic and old-fashioned. However, it's a very, very 21st century thing. For example, if your God is popularity, then you'll worry about what people think of you, and you'll fear having your reputation damaged. If your God is prosperity, then you'll fear missing out on the good life by not having something, and then you'll worry about losing what you already have. If your God is security, then you'll fear all uncertainty, and you'll constantly worry about the future. The 21st century gods of popularity, prosperity and security also get worshipped out of fear. So to talk of the fear of God is not that an old-fashioned idea at all. In Egypt, people feared the gods of Egypt. Don't worship them, and you feared that the Egyptians feared that their life would not be prosperous. For example, if they didn't worship the gods, then the gods would not send down rain. In Egypt, people feared the gods of Egypt and the king of Egypt. Go against his commands, and you'd not be popular. In Egypt, people feared the Nile. If the river Nile got polluted, say, for example, with blood, you'd have no way of making a living, and your future would be full of insecurity. In Egypt, people feared all of these things. But the two midwives, who acknowledged God as God, feared the Lord and lived differently as a result. Chapter 1, verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. The midwives feared God. And this isn't a, "oh no, God is going to smite me" type fear. But it's a fear based on their belief that the Lord was worthy of their reverence, their respect, their worship, and their obedience. You know, you can fear something because you're petrified, or you can fear something because you greatly respect it. This was the type of reverence and fear that the two midwives had. And this reverence for the true God caused them to obey God rather than the king. But their actions would mean that all of the world was stacked against them. They'd become unpopular with the king. They stood a high chance of losing their jobs. By siding with the Israelites, the gods of Egypt would probably not be too happy either. If these gods were the ones who truly called the shots, these midwives could hardly look forward to a life of prosperity. It would not be their back gardens that would be blessed with abundant harvests, sent down by the gods of fertility, fruitfulness, and rain. A life of worship and obedience to God will not make you popular or prosperous, and there is no earthly guarantee that such a life will pay off. But when you fear God, when you truly believe that He is the one and only God, when you fear and believe in God, no matter what is against you, you always have God for you. And as the midwives discovered, that is what matters most of all. Verse 20 of chapter 1. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, He gave them families of their own. The king of Egypt, he thought that he was the man who called the shots, trying to stop the Israelites multiplying. But God proved that He is the one who calls the shots. He had the Israelites continue to multiply, and He calls these God-fearing midwives to have children as well. In the same way, many other 21st century gods like to make us think that they call the shots. But Exodus 1, page 1, reminds us that this is not the case. For example, the god of popularity makes us think that it calls the shots. If you don't have popularity, you are nobody. Lose popularity, and you are a loser. The god of prosperity makes us think that it calls the shots. If you miss out on this earth's riches, you've missed out on everything that's worth having. If you don't own it, you'll be forever sad. The god of health makes us think that it calls the shots. When you idolize health above everything else, then if you get the big C, then you cannot feel secure about the future, because cancer is now in control of your life. Or if you get some terrible chronic disease, then you've nothing to look forward to ever again. Every 21st century idol or God wants us to believe that it calls the shots. However, I'm very pleased to say that God, the Lord, is God. Only He calls the shots and no one else. In regards to popularity, if obeying God causes you to become unpopular with others, it is still worth it. It's so much more important to be popular with the Lord who created everything. If God loves you, there is no point in looking to other people to make you feel you are important and valuable. For God's love is the only thing that truly matters. In regards to prosperity, if you don't have much in the way of earthly riches, you don't need to worry. God's got much better blessing in store for His people, blessings that are primarily experienced in the life to come. If you give up stuff because of your faith in God, don't stress. You won't regret it in the long run. In regards to security, if you get the big C, remember the big G. God will still be with you in your walk through cancer. And God's Son has conquered death as well. There is no cancer or chronic disease that God cannot reverse. God is the one who calls the shots in life. Therefore, the thing we should be most concerned about is loving, trusting, and obeying Him. Firstly, God is the God, therefore we should fear Him. A fear characterized by love, trust, and obedience. Secondly, God is the God who keeps His promises. Therefore, we should have faith. The Exodus story is all about Israel's divorce from Egypt. Israel and Egypt going their separate ways. And whenever someone, for example a child, is stuck in the middle of a divorce, they have a choice. Who will they live with? Which parent's house will they count as their own? One way for a mother or father to influence their choice is through promises. For example, a parent might promise a child that they'll convert the spare bedroom into a games bedroom. I promise I'll make sure you have all the best things. I promise you a home with a conservatory, faster internet, and a holiday home in Spain. It's sadly through manipulative promises like this that, for many children, it swings the deal. One parent is chosen because that parent promised more than the other. One man who was stood in the middle of Israel and Egypt's great divorce was Moses. Moses was born an Israelite, but as we learn in chapter 2, he grew up as an Egyptian. Which nation would he side with? Which God would he choose? Would Moses choose option A or option B? Option A, be an Egyptian and worship Egyptian gods. Option B, be one of God's people, identify with the Israelites, and worship the Lord. Option A involved a home with one big, massive conservatory. We read in chapter 1, verse 1, that the Israelites were enslaved to build the store cities Pithom and Ramses. If a place has an entire city to store its excess goods, it certainly has to be pretty prosperous. Option A involved promises of security. The River Nile provided Egypt with a constant water supply that provided people with water, crops, and a living. Option A involved promises of popularity. As the king's adopted son, Moses had every opportunity to become someone big and successful. Moses was faced with the option A that all of us are faced with every day. The 21st century gods promises prosperity, popularity, and security in abundance. Why even consider option B when such a great option A is available? For by siding with God and the Israelites, Moses was hardly choosing a life of instant rewards. As a worshipper of God, as an Israelite, Moses would lose all chances of becoming popular with everyone. Moses would be saying goodbye to the riches of Egypt and saying hello to a long walk through the desert. As a worshipper of God, Moses would be turning his back on the security of the River Nile and heading towards a place that he'd never heard of before or ever been. And yet, we read in chapter 2, verse 11, that Moses chose option B. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian Hebrew, one of his people. In the great divorce between Egypt and Israel, Moses identified himself as an Israelite. In the choice between option A, stay in Egypt, and option B, journey to the Promised Land, Moses chose option B. Why? Well, the New Testament book of Hebrews explains why. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 to 27. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not having the king's anger, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered, because he saw him who is invisible. Moses chose option B, because he knew who God is. God is a God who keeps his promises, no matter how long or how difficult the wait. God had promised the Israelites great blessing, and Moses was willing to wait. And let's not forget, Moses did need to wait, along with the rest of God's people. Let's not forget that though God instantly and clearly rewarded the faith of the two midwives, the rest of the Israelites had to wait many, many years. Let's not forget that though God multiplied the Israelites, those who were born into a life of slavery for many years before they would be set free. Let's not forget that Moses probably had great fun as the adopted son of an Egyptian king, whereas the Israelites' life in Egypt was characterized by groaning. And as we will see in later chapters, their journey in the desert also involved more groaning as well. You know, we might read Exodus chapters 1 and 2 and all find it very encouraging. The people keep multiplying. God's blessing the midwives. It's all very encouraging indeed. But to live a life of faith in God during those times was very, very hard. Choosing option B, a life of love and obedience to God, requires faith. That is why we need the book of Exodus, a book given to remind us that God always keeps his promises, no matter how long or how difficult the wait. No matter how long or how difficult it might be for you in your situation to have faith, God always keeps his promises. We can always trust him. We're reminded of this many times in these chapters. In Exodus, we see God multiplying Israel numerically so that they become a great nation, despite the king of Egypt trying to stop them growing. We see God showing himself to be great, despite the reluctance of the Egyptian king to let the Israelites go. In later chapters, we see God leading the people to the great place of the Promised Land, despite their time in Egypt and in the desert being difficult and long. Exodus is all about God keeping his promises, no matter how big the opposition. This is the main theme of Exodus. This is the main fact we all need to remember in our lives. For if you are a Christian, there is a constant temptation to choose option A. By not living out a life of faith, by not living as one of God's people, life at work might be easier. There's no need to show integrity or to be honest. Life at home or socially might be easier as well. There's no need to damage your reputation by speaking or living out your faith in Jesus Christ. Life might be more comfortable or enjoyable. No need to say yes to caring about others or sacrifice. No need to say no to certain unholy things. If you are a Christian, there is the constant temptation to choose option A. And for this reason, Exodus reminds us that God keeps his promises, no matter what. God rewards the faith of his people, even if they miss out on this earth's treasures, just like Moses missed out on the treasures of Egypt. God rewards the obedience of his people, even if that obedience involves becoming unpopular, just like Moses' later actions made him unpopular with the king. God rewards the love of his people, those who love God more than this world, more than their reputation, more than themselves. Never live to regret it. Just like Moses and the rest of the Israelites, who had to wait for God to fulfill his promises for a very long time. Exodus chapter 2 verse 23. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Information: God is the God. Application: God is the only one we should fear. Information: God keeps his promises. Application: we are to exercise faith in each and every situation we find ourselves in, living as one of his people every day.